I'd like to thank Brother Walter again for coming out to promote So let me just start off with this. So now we can sit down, I guess, when you finish. So, you ready? Is everybody ready? That's cool. So let me just start off by saying, as I say to my students all the time, if you get upset, well, too bad, I guess. Yeah, I may say things that might seem offensive to you, perhaps. So I'll talk about race, I'll talk about history, I'll talk about religion, and I'm really not here at all to offend anybody. That's the honest truth. And as I always tell people, as I heard earlier, right? You don't have to believe anything I say, but you should find out for yourself. If what I'm saying is not true, you should find out for yourself. And you should ask the question, why, in fact, I have those feelings, or why, in fact, I think in that particular way. So let's just start off by looking at this image here. This is actually a real image that was printed in the newspapers at the end, conclusion of the 1800s, the beginning of the the turn of the century, 1900. And of course, you can see, who's this fellow here? Uncle Sam. Who does he represent? The United States, right? In front of him, you see, anybody see that? That's the Philippines. That's Hawaii. There's Puerto Rico, and there's Cuba. In fact, the Hawaiian must be all Nuha over here, you can see. But again, you must be wondering, what the hell what do you see? Lecturing, teaching, preaching. Well, of course, this is right after the so-called war with Spain, the Spanish-American War, where the United States gains possession and control, I should say, of those 4 territories. And you see Hawaii kind of stuck it in the middle, as if Hawaii was really part of the Spanish-American War. See, that's part of the mythology, as we'll find out. Hawaii really had nothing to do with the Spanish-American War, as Hawaii was not a Spanish colonial territory. However, Hawaii was used as a military base, in a sense, for the taking of those Spanish territories. But you see, this is part of that propaganda which kind of takes Hawaii, which at that time, out of those 4 countries, Hawaii was the only independent nation state. The other 3, in fact, were colonies of Spain, who then were inherited by the United States at the completion of the Spanish-American War. Well, how about, who are these guys here? You see, I can't really tell you yet, but those are all representatives of the states, the various states. And just to look at, how are they acting in this picture here? Appropriate good students. Yeah. Take a look at what they look like. And then you notice in the back there, what do you see in the very back corner? It's an African guy, African American, doing what? Washing windows. He's not even in the classroom. Well, he's in the classroom to do what? To work and clean. Then you get the Indian in the corner, outside the doorway. Interesting. Almost out the door. And he's sitting there reading a book. And what do you notice about the book? It's upside down. It's kind of a representation of this kind of uncivilized, dumb people. And then who do you see outside the corner that's trying to sneak in? It's a Chinese guy. So you got to understand, at that particular time in history, what's called the Yellow Peril was this idea in the United States we were fearful of the so-called yellow people coming into the States. And they had all kinds of quotas and all kinds of rules about Chinese and Japanese coming into the United States. But to me, this is a very important kind of lesson to understand. Again, this wasn't Hawaiians who created this image. These are their own images from the newspaper, which kind of portrays this is how they saw the world. Who were they to the world? Who were they in this so-called world? Who were we? And you can see we kind of reluctant, darkies, kind of forced into the classroom. We're part of the classroom, but we're not really part of the classroom because we haven't learned to adapt it. But interesting how they look at this whole picture. So to me, when I talk and I teach, I want you guys to understand that images are very powerful. Images say a lot in regards to how people see themselves and how they see the world and how they see other peoples outside. We can pass this one, sorry. Well, let me start off by quoting, of course, the great Malcolm X. And he says, of course, looking at history, he says, history is a people's memory. And without a memory, man is demoted to the lower animals. It's really a control of our history. It speaks and gives us humanity. Just as a tree without roots is dead, a people without history or culture roots also becomes a dead people. So it also tells you, how do you bring life to this tree? See, that's the opposite effect. Yeah? By history and the study of history, you grow the roots again. You grow the roots again, the tree blossoms again. Well, let's talk about politics and let's talk about history. And first of all, let me just also say, I am not a historian. I never claimed to be a historian. But I like to tell stories. So stories are a little more flexible in regards to the rules that I can play. And yes, I have an agenda, and I'll talk about that. You know, number two, history is past politics, and politics presents history. We talk about history, forget, history is just about things that happened in the past. History is about today. History is about making sense of today by looking at the past. So many times we argue about the past in political struggles of today. Right? Think about the right to bear arms. What do they look back to in regards to history? People talk about whether or not you have a right to bear arms.
Constitution.
The Constitution, which was written when? Kind of a long time ago. And people go, you know, Kaleikoa, we should go back to the good old days of the Constitution. Really? When women weren't even counted as voters? When blacks were counted as 3/5 of a human being? When Indians weren't even counted as human beings at all? That's the good old days? When slavery ruled the southern half of the United States? That's the good old days? What are you talking about? See, again, to understand perspective. Because you hear that a lot of people will talk as if somehow the Constitution is something that was passed down from God. And I don't know what God had to do with slavery. I don't know what God had to do with women not voting. I don't know what God had to do with those kind of criminal and evil acts that occurred during that period. Yet, these are the kind of things we hear today. Let me just kind of skip down. Until lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunters. Again, that's the role of history. That's why history is taught in this particular way in the schools. When we as little children are programmed, indoctrinated in particular ways of seeing the world and history. It has nothing to do with the truth. It has nothing to do with what actually occurred. It really has to do with glorifying the hunters over the hunted. Alex Haley says history is written by the winners. Winston Churchill, history will be kind to me for I intend to write it. And of course, his famous one, history is her story too. We must understand and recognize almost all of history that we think we understand as history was never written by women, or never recognized to be written by women. And I'm just going to skip through these, so just kind of go slowly. Actually, go back to the pictures, sorry. Go back to the very first one. First one, sorry. Yeah, so you notice, again, an image. What is this of?
Adam and Eve.
You sure, Adam and Eve? How do you know Adam and Eve? Okay, we'll come back to that. Go to the next one. Well, up here, what about the stop one? So you guys can recognize, what's this first stop story?
Pocahontas.
Pocahontas! In fact, Disney was such an important story, Disney made a film for all of us. The Hollywood version, of course, of a story that actually never happened as such at all. But Hollywood and Disney will create this kind of fantasy world where the great John Smith, in a kind of beloved way, was such a great person that even Pocahontas fell in love with him. And of course, as you see in the image there, you know, she jumps to save his life. All of it, let me just say, straight bullshit. Never occurred. Not at all. But it becomes the mythology that somehow, you see how fast many of you can recognize that. See, that's the powers of these mythologies. Next one, you see in the bottom, we're going to go back, sorry. What is this one here? You notice the American flag. You notice the firing squad, and people blindfolded standing. What's that? Anybody? That's familiar with the Katipunan movement. Filipinos, you should all know this. This is after the Spanish were kicked out of the Philippines. Who comes in marching in with their guns and ammunition? The United States comes in to take over. And what do? They get into an armed conflict with Filipinos who just got the Spanish out. And they move in as the new colonizers of the Philippines. And in fact, thousands, and I repeat, thousands of Filipinos were killed in these wars by the Americans. And in fact, there's a famous quote by famous American general, basically says, kill them all. The young, the old, he basically says, kill them all. I want you guys to understand, this is part of the history of the United States, even in places like the Philippines. In fact, this is not a cartoon, this is actually a newspaper, a United States newspaper, documenting. And if you take a picture of the, look at this. It's not a short-looking Filipino, that's a kid being shot. Just to kind of understand, when we talk about war, we talk about engagements. We get told of bad ISIS, we get all these kind of images of all these crazy terrorists running around the world. I want you to understand this is part of the United States history itself that we got to recognize. Now, I'm not saying, we should, my point is that this is a point to understand. Right? We got to understand this history, why we in this situation today. Okay. At the top, what is that? Where is that, first of all? Washington, D.C. Well, who are those guys? Well, let me just say, it wasn't Halloween they're walking around with sheets. Those are not ghosts. That's in the 1930s. The late 1930s. Openly walking within the streets of Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. Celebrating this country. And what are they carrying there in their hands? The flags. So I used to be, remember, just because you carry a flag, it don't mean that you're necessarily a good person. See, that's the point I want you to recognize. And maybe the same guys carrying the flags, they're just not using the sheets anymore. You think about that. And of course, the bottom picture, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. When Americans are looking to increase the amount of counts of the body count to show how well they were fighting the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. And in order to show that they were actually doing a pretty good job, they looked at the kill number. And the kill number meant everything. Of course, they didn't tell the people until things like the My Lai massacre came out that many times they were counting bodies of women and children too that were killed. And in fact, in many of the wars, it's not soldiers that are killed. It is usually the civilian population that is killed. And we can just look at places like in Turkey, and we can look at other places in the world today. Anytime you have wars, the casualties many times are the women and children and the old and the weak and the sick. So we must always remember that when we talk about war. Okay, now move on. And of course, this last picture here, this is Gandhi, and in fact, it's probably one of the more important pictures when Gandhi, one of his most important struggles in fighting the British Empire to decolonize, to get the British out of control of India. One of the more successful campaigns was the so-called walk to the salt. I forget the exact title, sorry. In which he told it, to the salt too, and basically say, hey, the salt belongs to our people. Why do we have to pay the British? Who the hell are the British to control our salt? And so by doing so, this was an act of resistance to say, I don't recognize the British control of the salt, and I will gather salt. And that created a huge movement of people saying, and what he said was, don't even worry about all the high laws of repression. Start with the small ones. Challenge those small laws. And again, this is just salt. But it's the process, you see, it begins the process. And in fact, that begins the end of the British Empire's control of India. Saw a hand raised up. Okay, go ahead, sorry. So what is a historical myth? Traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people. Let's consider the worldview of a people. A culture's myths are usually closely related to its religious beliefs and rituals. So this is what I'm going at. And you notice the word mythology, myths. An ideologically marked narrative which purports to give a true account. And you notice the word purports to give a true account. It doesn't say it's giving you a true account. What it's saying is purporting to give you a true account. So it's not really about the truth, you see. It's about making sure you create and passage this so-called idea of a narrative. Political myths are narratives through which we orient ourselves and act to feel about our political world. And just to look at this picture here, of course, what is this going on here? Boston Tea Party. You see how we understand this political myths. And there's a story. The colonists, of course, like the Tea Party of today, of course, yeah? No taxation without representation, right? And so the tea was dumped into Boston Harbor. And in fact, if you notice good, you look, what is all these Indians doing in the ship? Well, what's the story?
Costume.
They dressed up as, why did they dress up as Indians?
So they won't be recognized.
Well, that's the mythology, in fact. So they won't be recognized, so they're not going to be caught. So we're going to put up these Indian costumes. But actually, when you read the context of those who were participating, what they said, in fact, was, when they looked at themselves, they didn't see themselves as British. In fact, they started to call themselves what? Anybody know? Well, if you ever saw the movie by DiCaprio, what's the movie, the guy with the big knife and stuff, with the guy with the eye, and Gangs of New York. Remember the Gangs of New York movie? What did they call themselves? The natives, exactly. In fact, that's what happened. Those writers said the best way for them to describe themselves was to be natives. And so what the best thing they could do? They're going to dress up like the real natives. And that really is the behind the story scene of this Boston Massacre. And that's why they dressed up as natives. Not so they wouldn't get caught, but that was the best way they could feel themselves as being the so-called natives of that place at that time. And of course, what is this one here? Yeah, the Alamo. And that particular mythology. Of course, people don't tell you the rest of the story that, you know, it wasn't as if Americans were protecting American lands. You know, it's part of Spanish territory at that time. The Americans actually were settling into lands of Mexico. And that created, of course, that huge war. It was settled with the Treaty of Guadalupe. And of course, from that treaty, the United States inherited all of what becomes the Southwest United States, including California, which was then taken. So again, when you think about places like California, well, I'm a native Californian. And you know, you have all these illegal immigrants coming into California, so-called Mexicans. Well, I mean, historically, that area was part of Mexico a lot longer, in fact, than it's been part of the United States. Don't you remember that? And yet, the mythology, again, of identity is one that becomes constructed, where you try to remove that, erase that story, not recognizing California wasn't just California as part of the United States. That comes to a particular history, and in fact, war, in which the California territory becomes part of the United States after the Treaty of Guadalupe. Okay. Political myth. A myth is an interpretation of what the myth maker, rightly or wrongly, takes to be hard fact. That's why my point is to understand it has nothing to do with what is true. It's what they want it to be true. See, that's the difference. But by the fact that it is believed to be true again. Believed to be true. Well, let's look at some mythologies. As the great John Henry Clark, great African historian, says, powerful people cannot afford to educate the people that they oppress. Because once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power. You will take it. See, once you see your history and you see yourself in human sense, as Hawaiians, we are human beings. I have no need to convince you of my humanity. I will demand my humanity. I will not accept anything less. You see, once you start to educate yourself to see yourself in the manner I said here, you're not going to beg anymore. You act in that manner. Well, let's start off with this first mythology. Again, you get mad. Too bad, as I say. But of course, the first one, who built the Great Pyramids? Well, let's go look at Hollywood's version of this story, images. And of course, in the top left corner, we see that slide there. To the far left, who's that character?
Moses.
Moses. You sure? That's what the movie said. That's Moses. How about the guy next to Moses? Yul Brynner. That's Ramses. Yeah, and in the story, the mythology, where does Moses come from in the story? Where does he come from? The river. Which river? The Nile. Which river? Okay, remember that now. Which river? Okay. Yeah, and Moses, the so-called adoptive mother, is supposedly a sister of Pharaoh. She raises him as her son. And they raise like brothers in the household under Seti. That guy. That's the Hollywood version. Yeah? And Seti loves Moses because, man, Moses is such a great guy. He listens, he's a warrior, he does all those things. Now Ramses, tough dude, but he's kind of a little bit more. There's a harder side to him. And so, of course, in the story, Moses is the one who leads his people, the Israelites, out of bondage. And we look at cartoon figures. Check out this one in here. That's the images we get bombarded with. Bombarded in our brains thinking, these guys must know something we don't know. So who built the Great Pyramids? The Great Pyramids of Giza, for example. Well, of course, the answer is, who are the Egyptians? Should we go back to the first one? Okay, now go back again. I wonder which one is Moses. Even the National Geographic had to admit, when we talk about ancient Egypt, the farther back you look into ancient Egypt, the darker they are. That is a fact. In fact, they never really start to lighten up the color until several hundred years BC, after the Assyrians came and conquered part of Egypt. But the black pharaohs, I mean, you can look at the photo. I mean, check these women out. Check this guy. It's like Denzel Washington right there already. But think again how powerful those images are. Why did Hollywood give us the other image? There's more images. Check these out here. I mean, check that guy out. It's like one of the rappers I see right now. I mean, look at that beard, that hair, that fro. I mean, check out these women. More. Continue. Well, we should remember, where is Egypt? Africa. And this is what I hear sometimes. This is from professors. But Kaleikoa, Egypt isn't really African. Huh? You see how powerful that idea, that they cannot put it together. In fact, psychologists call that cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is, even when you show them the truth is so powerful, they gotta find ways to like ignore the truth. Because their mind has been so warped by the narrative, the political mythologies, that they're unable to reconcile the truth. Yes, let's go back in. Egypt is in Africa. Next one. But let's also be reminded, the Great Pyramids up to the north are in Africa. But if you were to follow the Nile, what direction does the Nile flow? From south to north. It's one of the few great rivers that actually goes from south to north. So let's go back to the Moses story. Which direction did he flow? From south to north. When you ask the Egyptians in their own documents, they tell you, where did they come from? From south to north. And in fact, if the farther south you go, the older, I repeat, the farther south you go, the older the artifacts you find in regards to these Egyptian peoples, which are the traditional name called the Kemetic peoples. And you can see in these two pictures here, and you can see again the locations of these. But the question is, why is that such a big deal? Why is it such a big deal that the Egyptians were Africans? Why? Why is it a problem for Africans building the pyramids?
Because they were so technologically advanced.
Correct. And if they were technologically advanced, therefore,
They were smart.
civilization comes from where?
Africa.
Africa. You see, because the mythology is, you Hawaiians, you're lucky, man, these missionaries came from America and the Europeans who brought civilization to you. Writing was created thousands of years ago before the first European ever looked at a so-called book. And we can go to a place like Phoenicians and others in that area, besides the Egyptians. We're going to talk about high mathematics and algebra. Comes from these areas. You want to talk about astronomy and the great sciences? It comes from these areas. So we got to understand humanity. Who else comes from Egypt? Well, I'll get back to that. That's right. So, again, as if you look at here, you notice the white, the Nile River, you have the blue Nile and the white. I want you to look. Where does the river start? And where is Lake Victoria? Uganda. That's as black African as you can get. Above Uganda, you notice Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt. And I'll talk about Sudan, Ethiopia real soon. Next one. The so-called Kemet people, then later called by the Greeks, Ikopitos, we become the Egyptians. But the ancient name of this place, in fact, was Kemet. In fact, the word itself means black land. Now look at these, some of the earliest pictures of the African religion with Osiris and Isis. And you know, and you can look at them very closely and you can see the images. When you talk about Isis, I remember when I was growing up, there was a 70s TV show with Isis. How many of you guys remember that Isis kind of Wonder Woman show? I know she never looked like that. I think she looked like she came from California or someplace. But let's look at the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid. Well, we know it's for Khufu. Now, there's a little bit of this, discrepancy in words. Was it built before Khufu? Was it completed with Khufu? Starting with Khufu? And what I was told, that just this pyramid, just this one, if they were able to put 10 of those blocks in every day, huge blocks, align it perfectly, just 10 a day, would take over 600 years to complete this pyramid alone. So going back to technology, this is some badass technology. They knew something that we don't know. Today, of course, what's the coming? Oh, could have been Africans, must have been aliens or something. They come up with, these ideas. This is now, look at the date, 2500 BCE. Added to our 2000, you talk about 4,500 years ago. I repeat, over 4,500 years ago, this was created. And in fact, was the tallest man-made structure for over 4,000 years. Think about that. 4,000 years. It reigned as the most supreme structure. Think about that, how advanced technologically they must have been to have been able to create one of the 7 wonders of the world, which still stands.